friends, welcome to August 1st. It's time for your next quilt block in our Beginner Quilt Sampler. And this month, we are working on the Hourglass. Can you believe we've gotten this far? It's kind of crazy, huh? We're on month 8. So we only have 4 blocks left for the rest of the year. So this is mine, as you can see right here. These are all the blocks that I've made so far and the colors I'm using. So the Hourglass is actually a very simple block. It's a matter of cutting your squares on the diagonal and then sewing those 2 triangles together. You will have 1 extra of this and 1 extra of this piece that you could sew up for something else if you wanted. The main thing with this block is the trimming, and I've given you 2 options in the directions on using a 12.5-inch ruler, which is my favorite. I think that's a staple to have if you can, or you can use a 6.5-inch ruler if you've got that to be able to trim it up. So that's really the only part that you really need to think about, because you do have to trim it down a little bit. So let's get started on our August block, the Hourglass. So let's get started now on our August block, the Hourglass. Now I have already cut my fabrics according to the directions, and we'll label those here in a second. And at the end of the tutorial, you have 2 options for cutting the block down. Now, as a beginner, I highly suggest, if you don't have a 12 by 12 square ruler, that you invest in one. You can get any brand that you want. This is one that I very first got when I very first started quilting. It's from Havel's. And then I also have Creative Grids. And I am a Creative Grids fan because it has the grippy on the back. So you can also get that one from Creative Grids. But if you don't have that, then you're going to need a regular ruler. And this is the 6.5-inch ruler to square up this block. So there's 2 ways to do that. So I wanted to mention that to you. And you may want to watch this tutorial again at the very end when you get to the last step on how to trim the block. So we've got our fabrics here. Let's go ahead and make sure that they're labeled. So you've got your 3 squares that you've cut in half on the diagonal. And this is my background fabric, this off-white. So for me, that is fabric D. And then you're only going to need 1 of your B and A fabrics, your A and B fabrics. So these are just going to be extras. You could just sew those 2 together and make yourself a block and use that for something else, or just put it in your scrap pile. There's just no way to avoid that unless you want to make a second block. You easily could cut 1 more of your background and make a second block and, use it for something else. So we'll go ahead and label. For me, the terracotta is the B color, and the teal is the A color. Now, one thing I want to mention to you on the pattern, when you look at your pattern that you get for the month, is you'll notice on the back here, you'll notice this is a kind of a lighter shade of the teal. That always represents, and I'm sure you figured that out from our previous months, this is showing it's the back of the fabric, just as kind of a way to be able to show that to you. All right, so here's our instructions. And you've got those were emailed to you if you're a part of the Beginner Sampler series. For those of you finding this video that are not signed up and you're like, oh, I want to be able to make this block, this is part of a pattern, a block of the month pattern that I'm doing and hosting for 2025. This will be a full pattern that you can purchase for a beginner sampler quilt in early 2026. So check back on that if you're wanting to actually be part of this. It's closed for the year to those that have already enrolled. All right. So the first thing we are going to do is we are going to get 1 of our D fabrics, which I just took that off, and I'll set the other D one aside. And we're going to sew that to an A fabric. And you'll just look there at your diagram. And I always like to lay my fabrics out just like the diagram shows to make sure, I've got it right. I have a little bit of dyslexia, so it can be real easy for me to turn stuff around. And then mine are solid, so it doesn't really matter for me for the front and the back. But if you have a print, you're going to do pretty sides down. You're going to place those on top of each other. And then we are going to pin. And we're going to be stitching a 1/4 inch down this straight side here. So I like to do 2 pins. And I have starched because, you know, this is cut on the bias, so it makes that a little bit easier. And I'm going to go ahead and pin both of these together, just since I've got all of this here. So this is step 2, and then we're going to go ahead and pin our next one as well, which will be part of step 3, just so that I've got them together to sew them. Whoops. And this one is where your background will be on the bottom, and it'll be right sides together, and you'll do the same thing. You'll just pin those like this. All right, now that those are pinned, we're going to take this over to the sewing machine, and we're going to stitch a 1/4 inch down each side. So now I'm at the machine, and if these aren't lined up like 100% perfect, it's okay because these are going to be trimmed down. But we're going to go ahead, and I have on my patchwork foot, so that gives me a perfect 1/4 inch seam allowance. And then we're just going to stitch all the way down. And I just pull my pins out as I go. And then while we're here, I'm just going to go ahead and do the same thing for the other part of the unit. This is a really easy block to make. I think the main thing is the trimming. If you're wanting to make sure that it's trimmed precisely, I personally suggest the 12.5 inch ruler, because with that 12.5 inch ruler, you can trim down. I mean, we don't tend to make a lot of blocks over 12.5 by 12.5. Now, I sometimes do. I've done 14 and 16 inches, but for a lot of people, if you have that one square ruler, you can trim down so many blocks with that. So that's why I suggest that if you're new to this and you don't have that, would be best. Okay, let's take this over to the pressing station, and then we're going to press these. Okay, so I always like to set my seam first, and then for each unit you're going to press basically towards the colored fabric. I say colored, for me it's colored, but one you'll press towards A, one you'll press towards B. So for this one, this is my B fabric. So I'm just going to give this a little gentle nudge here first. I haven't used the starch yet, but a little gentle nudge just to make sure that all of that fabric is out of the seam there. And then I'm going to use some starch. This is actually pineapple. Oh, it smells so good. It's called Pineapple Grove by Flatter. I'll link it for you in the description box. If you're not sensitive to smells, it is wonderful. All right. Okay, so we've got that one pressed. We'll do the same thing for this one. This one we're going to press towards A. And I'll set that seam first. And like I said, I'm just kind of bumping up there along the edge just to make sure there's no fabric that's caught up in that seam. When that happens, then your blocks, you know, your seams are not going to line up because you're missing some fabric there. Then I'm just going to give this a good press. Again, this is cut on the bias, so there can be some warping otherwise. So I am big on pressing. All right, now that we've got those pressed, let's go nest these together and sew our block together. Okay, so we've got our 2 pieces here, and you're just going to want to make sure, of course, that when you look at the diagram that you've got it laid out correctly. So your 2 background fabrics here are going to be on this side, and then you've got your A and your B fabrics here. So I always lay mine out first, and then you're going to put right sides together. So I'm just going to flip this one over, and we're going to nest our seam. And you'll see how, because we pressed the way we did here and made sure we pressed really well, we're going to pin that, and this will help keep that seam in place whenever you're stitching. And if you want, because this can kind of move a little bit, I usually go ahead and pin also down here and then at the other end. And again, remember, if it's not perfectly lined up, that's okay, because this is going to be trimmed down to make it be a 12.5-inch block. So we've got those pinned all the way down there, and now we're just going to sew a nice 1/4-inch seam all the way down here. And I just slide that pin out when I get close to it. I don't sew over pins. When I first started quilting, I had one break and land in my face, which could have ended up in my eye, so I don't sew over pins anymore. But you do what works for you. Okay. Now we've got that sewn together. Let's double check and make sure that our points line up really well. They do. Our seams. We nested really well here. So then we're going to take this to the pressing station, and we're actually going to press this direction here, so this lays nice and flat. Actually, no, we're going to press it open. Let's press this open. Sorry about that. So this lays flat. So let's press this open. And I just take my finger here, just kind of open that up as I go. I just kind of slide it along this way. Just kind of wiggle just a little, but not a whole lot. And we're just kind of pressing lightly all the way down. And then we'll flip it over and give it some starch. And make sure all your little threads, especially if you use a light fabric, all your little threads are cut and out of the way. You don't want these to accidentally end over on this side. And if you quilt this and you have dark threads, that you know it will show through on the white. So I just go ahead and clip any threads that look like they could cause an issue. Then we'll flip this over. Gonna give it another really good starch and press here. And then I'm gonna show you the 2 ways that you can trim down this block depending on which ruler that you have. Okay, my preferred and favorite way to trim is actually with this 12.5-inch by 12.5-inch ruler, or any 12.5-inch ruler. And the way you're going to do that is you'll notice there's a line here, a 45-degree angle. You'll just line up. There is a little mark here that shows the center. There's a little bitty yellow arrow in there. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to line up this 45-degree line along that seam line the best that I can. And, you know, depending on how careful you are with sewing a straight stitch and a straight seam, yours may vary slightly. I apologize. On this ruler, it looks like the black, there's a little bitty black arrow here that is the center. Sorry about that. So you're going to want to make sure this is lined up completely here. And you're going to want to make sure that in each of the corners here, your corner is lined up with the corner of each of your points there. So you've got this line here, and you've got this end of your ruler lined up in that seam, this one lined up in this seam, and this one lined up in this seam. The best that you can, right? You may not get complete perfection, but this way we're able to trim our block down, and this way it will be 12.5 inches. And so you're just going to trim all the way around here to make a 12.5 by 12.5 inch block. So I grabbed my rotating cutting mat for this. If you have one, this is really, really helpful, because otherwise, if I'd left it on the mat the way I had, then I'm having to like cut this way, and then you have to kind of change hands, and it can cause you to move your ruler. So another thing that is something you'll use a lot is a rotating spinning cutting mat. And this one is a 14 by 14. This is from Creative Grids. And I love it because it's large. Some come at a 12 inch. I really like this one because it's 14, so I have a little bit of extra so I can see here along the sides. So I've made sure that, again, it's aligned up on that 45-degree angle there, and I've got all the edges of the blocks lined up almost perfectly there, and you might have to just kind of wiggle that a little bit. And then I'm going to go ahead and cut. And again, if you have, I suggest the Creative Grids. I actually grabbed this one. The Creative Grids has grippy to keep the ruler from slipping. This one doesn't, so I have to be really careful with it. But it was the very first one I started out with. You can see when you have a 12 by 12 ruler, you can actually trim down a lot of blocks from that size. So you can actually use washi tape. Say this was, let's see, what was this one? An 8 inch. I was trying to cut down 8 inch or 7.5 inch squares. And so you can just use washi tape and mark your ruler, and then it just comes right off without leaving any sticky. And that way you can trim. And then we've got all of our sides. Whoops. Did I not cut all the way through that? I don't think I did. There we go. Okay, there we go. And you'll just make sure everything cut. We got a little dog ear. I actually need to probably change my blade on my rotary cutter. And that is how you would trim if you are using the square ruler. Now, if you don't have a 12.5 inch square ruler, then you're going to want to take one of your rulers that is at least 6.5 inches. And you're going to want to line up your ruler, and you're going to cut at 6 1/4 on each side. Now this has already been cut, so you can see here, there's this little edge right here. I have already cut off what I needed to cut off when I used the square ruler. So you're going to want to basically trim this down where it's 6 1/4 on both sides, all the way around 6 1/4. And that way, if you add 6 1/4 and 6 1/4, you end up with 12.5. So that is how you would trim down with this ruler, is just making sure you use the center to line that up to be able to do that. I personally prefer, like I said, the square ruler, but otherwise that is another way to do that. All right, friends, congratulations. You have now made the August Hourglass block, and I will see you on September 1st for our next block. Until next time, quilty friends, make lovely things.